Hello, everyone, and welcome to the COP28 Dialogues. My name is Anne-Marie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Office for Partnerships, and I'm at the SDG Pavilion at the UN Climate Conference in Dubai.
And my name is Ian Phillips, and I'm joined at United Nations headquarters in New York today by Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed.
Hi. In Dubai, I'm joined by four distinguished guests who are taking on urgent question that affects us all: how to accelerate a just, equitable renewables transition and safeguard lives and livelihoods from worsening impacts. With me in the COP28 SDG Pavilion in Dubai are Madam Mayor Yvonne Akiz Sawyer, Mayor of Freetown and co-chair of C40. We have Dr. Christophe Maglade, head of Energy Supply Unit of the International Energy Agency and the lead author of the World Energy Outlook. We also have Agnes Hall, campaigns director at 350.org, and we are joined by Professor Avinash Prasad, who is the special envoy to our SDG advocate, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. Welcome to you all. It's wonderful to see you. In a few moments, we're going to hear their thoughts on how we can make a difference on the necessary transition to a future free from fossil fuels. But first, back to New York. Ian?
2023 has been a year to take stock. This year, we reached the midpoint of the Sustainable Development Goals, our blueprint for a better world for people and the planet. At this year's UN Climate Conference, another stocktake is taking place of the progress made on the climate commitments the world agreed to in Paris back in 2015. Let's now watch a video on why this is so important.
It is so decided.
DSG, you were the architect involved in the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, and this year you've been a powerful voice for accelerated action to make them a reality by the 2030 deadline, including Goal 13 on climate action. Where do you think the world now stands in our collective response to the climate crisis?
Right, thank you, and hi to colleagues on the other side. Well, we're not doing as well as we thought we would. We had a global stocktake on the SDGs and we were streets behind, and on climate, we're not there to get through that window of 1.5 degrees. The ambition has not been set for all three aspects of the global stocktake. We hope we'll get the signals out of this meeting that everyone's at, not for the emissions and really phasing out fossil fuels, not for the ambition on the finance and the efforts into adaptation and what that means for many countries for which it's too late. And then, you know, the finance, it's the big question. We can agree that all these things are the way to go on transitions, but if we don't get the finance right, and the finance right in the context of many countries that are having to lift heavy burdens of debt, or perhaps don't even have the enabling environment in finance to have those investments come their way.
What are your observations so far about COP so far? You're talking to people on the ground. Mm-hmm. Are you optimistic? Are you seeing good signs?
Well, we're looking at this from far. You all know in the room there and in the streets of COP, blue or green zone. But what we're seeing from here, and I think it's helpful to know, we know that we're not we're not quite there yet. There's some good news on the loss and damage. Whatever we say, that's the shortest time we've seen a fund put together and money in it. And I think that should lift spirits that we can do. And so I feel that the global, the Green Climate Fund was also a good indication that we got over the 10 billion. We have to see the money land in the account. But I think that, you've got a huge momentum on one side of the aisle. Can it infect the other side of the negotiators to really pull them up and say things have got to be done? Now, there is an awful lot to be said to the G20. These are really, frankly, the main culprits. And we have to be able to engage with them. Together with fossil fuel industry, I think they also have made some commitments on one side of green, but they've got to make a whole lot more on the other side. And so I think from here, we're hopeful. You've got a few more days yet, and it was a good start. So let's hope that we can make much more movement because those signals will be important to the world.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General. And we'll now head back to Dubai and over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks so much, Ian. We're in the first week of COP28 here in Dubai, where stakeholders from heads of state and policymakers to climate activists, civil society, and the private sector are gathering to correct course and accelerate action to tackle the climate crisis. As the Deputy Secretary General said, the reality is the climate crisis is still outpacing countries' efforts to contain it. 2023 is on course to be the hottest year in human history, impacting millions of lives and wreaking trillions of dollars of damage and destruction around the world. People everywhere expect governments to meet this moment with urgency and ambition it demands, and energy transition is frankly at the heart of the response to the climate crisis. So in this SDG dialogue, we'll discuss energy challenges and how to accelerate a just, inclusive, and equitable energy transition. Together with the DSG and this panel of experts, each of whom has a unique viewpoint to share on the climate crisis, Deputy Secretary General and Ian, please jump in with your questions as we go. But we expect this to be a lively conversation, as has the week been. Leaders and policymakers are definitely wrestling with the practical questions on how to transform energy systems and take fossil fuels out of the equation. In fact, Christoph, let's start with you. The transition to clean energy is happening worldwide. The World Energy Outlook shows that there are set to be almost 10 times as many electric cars, for example, on the road, with new renewables nearing half of the global power mix. Do you think clean energy transition is happening fast enough? And what kind of policies does the world need to keep 1.5 alive?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. It's a key topic. We are seeing the clean energy transition happening very, very quickly. It's actually happening significantly faster than many people appreciate today. If we look back just a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, for every 25 cars that were sold, just one of those cars was electric. This year, for every 5 cars that's sold, one will be electric. By 2030, for every 1 car that's sold that's an internal combustion engine car, one will be electric. That's a huge change in a very short period of time. We're also seeing great momentum on solar, huge increases in the rates of deployment. And actually, when we put all of these different things together, we are seeing that on the basis of the policies that governments have in place today, that will be sufficient to bring about a peak in each of oil demand, coal demand, and gas demand before the end of this decade. This is the first time we've been looking at energy markets for a very long time, projecting them forwards. This is the first time ever we've seen a peak coming in each of the fossil fuels. Now, that's a good start. A peak is what we need to see happening, but it's very important to see the decline afterwards. And unfortunately, on the basis of today's policies, that decline in fossil fuel use won't be fast enough. So the key things we're looking for in this COP, and we're looking for all governments to come together, is on to pledge a tripling in renewables capacity by 2030 and a doubling in energy efficiency. If we see those 2 things happening, we will have a significant reduction in fossil fuel demand. Many countries are signing up to this. We are seeing an increasing number of countries every single day signing up to this. Hopefully that can be formalized in some of the discussions that are ongoing at the minute.
Building on this, Madam Mayor, as a city leader and in the Global South and now the co-chair of C40 globally, how can communities with limited resources bring about a transition to renewable energy? What are the primary challenges in this transition, and what are you particularly tracking at COP this time?
Thank you very much. I want to start off by just picking up on what was just said and in terms of the need for that trebling of investment and the doubling of energy efficiency. And I want to make the point that cities across C40s and outside C40s are already leading the way. So the data we have show that 75% of city governments are cutting their emissions faster than their national governments. And 60% of them are working on transition plans that bring in those renewables. So the first thing I just want to say, just touching on that, is it's really critical if we want to see that peak go down faster. We want to see that us meet the ambition in order for us to get to where we need to get to preserve 1.5. We need city actions to come in and be supported by government. So at this COP, one of the things we're really thrilled about is the signing of the CHAMPS, the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnership, basically asking the governments, national governments, to incorporate city action in their NDCs. And I want to stress on this because if cities are acting and we don't have the collaboration, we then collectively we're not going to get to where we want to get to. So I just wanted to bring that point. And in terms of communities, there's a range. And I think one of the things that's important to recognize when we're talking about communities is that cities are so heterogeneous. And there are many, many cities, millions of people who are energy deficient. So the question of a transition is actually not the most critical. It's actually access to energy and making sure that energy is renewable. And there's a host of different opportunities for us to have first mover advantage, to leapfrog, not go down the fossil fuel route, and actually bring power, energy to communities by going straight to solar. But the missing piece is finance. I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious that I answered another question before I answered your question.
But it's the perfect segue because I'm going to ask Avi to jump in before we go back to New York. Avi, finance. Massive congratulations. Prime Minister Mia Mottley, instrumental on loss and damage, and now we have to get that operationally funded at a higher rate than we're seeing currently. But what is finance, and why is it so important in the renewable energy and a just transition?
It's vital, and let me give a different perspective coming from the finance side. So as DSG said, the global stocktake is showing that we are off track significantly in aggregate. But if you break it down, there's some countries in which they are on track and renewables are growing quite considerably, and other countries where that's not happening. And the fault line is the cost of capital, because the operational costs of renewables is now very low, in many cases below fossil fuels, but they're very capital intensive. And the cost of capital is this huge gulf. A solar farm in Germany, the cost of capital is 4 percentage points. In South Africa, the same solar farm, the same tech, the same power purchase agreement, it's 14%. And that's why it's not happening in developing countries. And the problem is that that's where the biggest growth in energy demand is going to be. So the energy transformation, if we're going to preserve 1.5 degrees, has to take place in countries which are now the big emitters. 63% of emissions are coming from developing countries. That's going to rise to 80% very quickly. And that's because of the cost of capital. So I think, Paris is set up around ambition, which is perhaps the only way it could start. But ambition without finance is empty ambition. And we now need this finance in developing countries. And the main thing we need is an instrument that lowers the cost of capital. And the final point I'd make about this cost of capital is that the majority of this cost of capital is actually a perception problem. So 14% is the cost of capital for a solar farm in South Africa. 12 of that 14% is the cost of capital of lending to the government. It's the currency risk, the country risk. You have to spend 12 percentage points to hedge those risks. But over a long period of time, we find the actual risk, the rand falling, the country risk, default risk, credit risk, is only 6% per year. You're paying 12, but the actual risk is 6. That gap is a perception of risk. And that gap is blocking the flow of capital to developing countries. That gap is stopping us getting to preserving 1.5 degrees. And we can do that with guarantees around these macro risks. Not guarantees that means that it costs nothing or it's subsidizing, but we're reducing the perception gap, reducing the excess risk premium. That's what we need to do. And of all the things in the Bridgetown Initiative, that's the thing that's moving slowest. We've got the loss and damage fund. We've got a notion of tripling MDB lending. We've got pause clauses. We've got SDGs rechanneling. We have very little on reducing macro risks in the key developing countries that we need to be fully engaged in the green transformation.
Thank you so much, Avi. And this idea of risk and how do we deal with it? It's something that I know the Deputy Secretary General has been very much focused on. Ian, I'm going to go back to New York for some reflections from your side.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So DSG, we've heard some encouraging lines from Dubai about the momentum at the conference, but I'm curious about how this translates at the individual level, at the general public level. Yes, there is progress, but at the same time, time is running out. Is enough being done for this message to trickle down to normal people to change their habits and to be able to change their habits?
I think so. I think there's a lot more conversation with the consumer today. I mean, when we look at the emissions that are coming out of China, they are the most that we have on the planet today, but per capita, the consumption in the US is huge. Are we speaking to people as well as governments that you've got to all jump in here and reduce that carbon footprint? But I want to switch back to Avi because I think he was touching the point on governments that probably in some cases have better macroeconomic fundamentals and getting, because of the perception, are getting charged far more for what we are talking about, investments. They're not handouts. Everyone wants this transition for everyone's right to develop. And I think that here we've got to have a very serious conversation when the Secretary General talks about the international financial architecture, the role of the credit rating agencies, the role of the multilateral system in believing and sending those signals that these countries are ripe to invest in. But the minute the signals are sent to the markets that these are not safe places to go, your investments are not safe, the capacities that we need to ramp up these huge transitions are not there, then you're almost setting everyone up to fail. So I think we have the blue, the green, the turquoise vehicles. We know exactly where we want to go and how, but there's no fuel. There's no green fuel, and that green fuel is money. And that has to come to the table, and it has to come quickly. And we know that it can. I mean, we have, governments who turn around on a sixpence with a cause and billions go out the door on a sixpence. And yet we are here 8 years later after Paris, and we're quibbling about 100 billion or a few billion that goes into the loss and damage fund. Enough is enough. We have a 1.5 degree window to get through, and it's all of us. And in case those that don't believe it's all of us, just look at the science.
So it's about priorities. Right?
It is. Well, it's about power, it's about priorities, it's about justice and equity and solidarity with our humanity. There's a moral compass here that we seem to be throwing away on one side. And I think that we have to have those very honest conversations, and please do that in COP. I mean, I don't know how many of these will be real in one side of the zone, but as I said, the other side needs to infect the other one. You pass each other in the corridor. I think there has to be a wake-up call, and this has been the largest COP, quite frankly, and it's been growing. So, credit to everyone in the constituency, it has been growing, but it has to come out with something. We can't have people for nothing. People have got to gather, they've got to deliver, leaders have got to deliver, the fossil fuel industry has to deliver, and it's got to do it for the science behind the 1.5 degrees.
Thank you, DSG. And back to Dubai.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, DSG. You just said it's about everyone, and that really segues right into Agnes. How are you able to convince a very large constituency that they are able to make a difference in the climate crisis? Do you think the call to phase out fossil fuels is being heard, and is the transition growing to renewables?
Thank you. I think we are experiencing the hottest year on record. We're seeing climate impacts escalating all around the world, and to some degree, people don't need convincing. It's very much a case of we're seeing heat waves, we're seeing droughts, we're seeing cyclones, and it's terrifying. So people are standing up and they are taking action and they are speaking out. And particularly in the face of government inaction, I think that, is inspiring people to really lift up their voices and make sure that their demands are being heard. And all of this, in fact, in a world where we're witnessing increasing shrinking of civic space, where it's becoming harder, increasingly harder to speak out safely because of the risks that people face. The other day, we saw the arrest of 7 East Africa activists who are campaigning to stop the East Africa crude oil pipeline. Our former colleague, Hoang Thi Minh Hong in Vietnam, is in jail and has been for over 180 days to date. This is, people are really putting their lives on the line to take action. So it's potentially less so about convincing people rather than giving people pathways to take action and supporting that, that movement and the activists doing that work. And I think people take heart in seeing this action around the world, and it inspires solidarity in other countries. And that's when we see, we're able to see a sort of global movement moments. Ahead of this COP, we were able to mobilize in over 64 countries calling for renewable energy and investment in renewable energy. And we had this mobilization, and it was called Power Up, which is, of course, all about moving off fossil fuels and onto renewable energy. And what we're doing now is bringing those voices into the COP. I'm here with my colleagues from the Pacific, and as I said, I'm here with the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline campaigner. And it's very much about bringing these voices into this space so that, these demands can be heard and that can translate into real action. I think also people are really inspired by the opportunities they see around renewable energy. We know that the solutions are there. And in fact, we know that the money is there. We just need the money to flow in the right direction and into renewables. And so I think, that's also something that people are really sort of putting their weight behind and saying, this is what we want. And I think, to speak to the points that were being made earlier about finance, we need a fully financed transition of fossil fuels that's, I think, full and fast and forever, and we need that investment in renewable energy to really power up our future of clean energy access for everyone, with that strong justice element where people who don't have energy access can get clean energy access. So I think that's also an incredibly important part of the implementation. We set the North Star of the renewable energy target, hopefully get that into the outcome text, the decision text at the end of COP this time, and then we can look at, sort of a just transition and the implementation of that. I'll stop there.
I think you made such good points. Avi, jump in.
This is very much the reason why the UN needs to play an important role in this process, because we need to link the climate change with development very strongly, and the SDGs. The cost of adjustment from where we are fossil fuels is going to be most costly on the poor. And so that's why we need the finance. The United States of America is the world's largest oil producer, the world's largest oil producer. Canada is one of the largest oil and gas producers. If we can't stop fossil fuels there, and yet we're expecting it to take place where the cost of the transition is so much more expensive, I think that's a problem. So we really need to think about development and think about finance, because there are huge developmental impacts from these transitions.
And I just say that, what Abby's just said, the ingredient that's missing in that case with the US, with Canada, is obviously not finance, it's political will. And that's where we come back to the position that Anna's taken in respect of the activists. It's really, I think we've gotten to a point, not that we weren't there before, but maybe even more so, now that we're tipping points, now that we're seeing, as Antonio Guterres has put it, us being in a position of climate breakdown. That urgency now means we've got to be better at joining the dots. And I think that's one thing that has been positive for me at this COP. The fact that local leaders are here for the first time ever. There's been a local climate ambition summit in the blue zone. And it means, and I think the trick is going to be, can these voices that we have here make it through into the negotiations? And if it doesn't, then what? And I think we don't have the luxury of if it doesn't. And this is why I come back to the position of the national determined contributions, because at the moment, it's been government speak. You know, what we're proposing with CHAMP, or what 64 governments have signed up to, including Canada and the US, is that they will allow city actions, city interventions to be documented. And that immediately begins to address some of the reluctance, because city leaders so far seem to be willing to go further than their national governments.
And we've seen where cities lead and countries follow, often in so many instances. Christophe, before I send it over back to New York, would you like to jump in here?
Yes, just very quickly, because I think there is sometimes a perception out there. We sometimes hear arguments that there is a trade-off that has to be made between sustainable development and climate action. And we need to make it very clear that is not the case. There are 750 million people, more than that, who don't have access to electricity today. There's 2.5 billion people who don't have access to clean cooking, so they rely on wood. It's incredibly polluting. It's a huge cause of premature deaths. And what we know is it's completely possible to have universal access to energy by 2030. So for both of those numbers to be zero in 2030, while getting on track for 1.5 degrees. There is no need for a trade-off between us.
I'm going to say, ask me about it.
Money.
The technology might be there in my city. We know the technology is there. We don't have the money to finance it. So
let me add another dimension, because many of these things appear voluntary. But from a developing country, it becomes mandatory. So let us say we say yes to an ambition, that we're going to get there. We're going to find that the next day we go to the World Bank and ask for a loan. They say, you're not eligible for that loan because you haven't hit your ambition. So we have to be very careful to make sure that these ambitions are financed. And so there is a trade-off if they're not financed. So let's get the finance there and remove that trade-off.
And I wouldn't be fair for me not to mention that I can't even go to the World Bank on my own, because the World Bank will say, I only work through the national government. So we have an infrastructure challenge in terms of the financial markets, of the financial infrastructure, to ensure that these ambitions can be achieved.
That note, let me send it back over to New York. DSG and Ian, your reflections.
Well, I often put myself in the head of a young person growing into this world, and you listen to these arguments and you think, but it's so obvious what needs to happen. Do you feel that those people's voices are being heard and that governments will listen to that, and ultimately they will have to change, because this isn't just a matter of human survival, it's also their political survival, right?
Well, I think young people's voice has been heard loud and clear at COP, and it's been amplified more and more. So I think, as someone said, it's not that they're not hearing, it's whether they do anything about it. And I think that the action is, let me just go quickly back to the mayors. I mean, cities, when the mayor of London decides he's going green, fossil fuel industry will hurt. Now, there are many cities that can do this, maybe not in Yvonne's case, but what you can do as a co-chair is you twin with the other cities. The alliance of cities is that those that have and those that don't have can actually show that way forward. You don't have to sign up with the World Bank if the government now sees the role of cities in that constructive way. You know there's a political debate between mayors and heads of state and government, so let's not go to that piece. Let's actually see what cities do to deprive the brown from going green. And those are consumers, those are young people, and most young people are in the cities, and most of them are going to be there by 2050. And I do want to go back to this whole injustice piece, because today we are finding that we are, in the developing world, being held to a much higher standard than those who have polluted and that we have the least to do with. That's what Avi's saying. And I think that that sense of injustice is creating a deficit of trust. And this can only not all go well for the world when we're trying to bring everyone together. So I think those issues as well, young people are the best to see that. They feel injustices, but I think we have to articulate them much more. That when I'm being asked for an energy transition in Africa, and yet I'm not being given the resources for it, and see that, you know, it's not just an energy transition, it's poor people, it's women, it's youth without hope, it's the sustainable development agenda. So I think, you know, no silos, let's do all of this together. It is huge, but we can do it. And as I said earlier, the billions to trillions are clearly there. We've seen them to fuel wars, to fuel things they shouldn't be fueling.
Absolutely. Back to Dubai.
So this has been an incredibly lively conversation, and I think we're finding those words and the voices that we need to take this forward and make sure that it gets into those outcome documents that then we can point to and make the commitments into action. Before we close, we have a tradition. One word you're feeling right now at COP. Agnes?
Hopeful.
Optimistic.
Excited.
Hopeful too.
I would say collaborative from my side, because I've seen what so many people coming together to work together with one voice, and that gives me some hope too. Your words in New York.
DSG, your turn.
Oh, I'm really anxious. I'm very anxious. Because from here I see the spirit of everyone collaborating and making lots of noise, and I'm anxious that we won't get across the line.
Well, thank you to all for our guests for engaging in this critical dialogue on pathways to a 1.5 future. We hope that this discussion has highlighted the importance of a just, inclusive and equitable energy transition and the urgency of collaborative efforts and decisive actions to address the climate crisis. You can follow the latest on the fight for a better climate future by going to un.org/climatechange. Thank you very much.
Thank you.